Director of the Department of Personnel and Administration, and she's going to share with us some upcoming changes to the system. So thank you very much for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me. So, can you all hear me okay in the back? Great, yeah. So, thank you all for coming and learning more about some of the changes. We like to refer to this as the Governor's Talent Agenda, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But basically, I'm going to be covering a couple of things. What we're going to do around retention, recruitment, and rewarding of our state workforce, and I'll talk some specifics about that. I'll talk about legislation, both those changes that we've made statutorily, and then the Amendment S that will be on the ballot at the end of the year in November. We'll talk about those things and then answer any questions that you all might have relative to this or anything else you might want to ask me in terms of DPA and what we're doing over there. So with that, I'll get started. And thanks for all of those of you who are listening to us or watching on your PCs. So a couple of things. I have been in this role for about 18 months, and when I came on board, one of the first opportunities that I saw as Executive Director of the department was the opportunity for change in terms of our state's personnel system. And if you are following along in your presentation, you'll know that the state's personnel system is approximately 100,000 employees statewide. So with all four borders, there are about 100,000 of us, and that would include higher education. But specifically, my role as the state's personnel director, I'm responsible for managing the state's classified system. And so the classified system is about some 33,000 employees. And so specifically, I thought there were a lot of opportunities for change. And so I'll explain what that means as we go forward. So the why. One of the big takeaways from my experience over the last 18 months was, the foremost, that the state's personnel system was developed some 92 years ago. Does anyone have any idea about how many employees we had 92 years ago when we started? Pretty close. We had about 20,000 state employees at the time when the state's personnel system was developed. And we've grown to some 100,000. And we've only had one significant period where there was any change. And that was some 40 years ago. And I'm slightly over 40 years old. And that means there's not been any substantial change to the state personnel system in my lifetime. And if you think about what change has happened over the last 40 years, I use the telephone as a perfect example. When I was growing up, you put your finger in the dial and you turned it around and you remember the little circle back. Well, we've gone from that 40 years ago to the small little handheld device that has no cords attached to it, if you remember that or understand that. And you equate that to the state's personnel system, it's almost unconscionable that we haven't had any change in some 40 years. The other particular fact that's important to note is that most of the change that we'll be talking about rests in the state's constitution. And that means that all of you in this room, if you're a citizen of the state of Colorado, which I believe you all are, and your friends and neighbors who are under the age of 18 will have an opportunity to vote on some of the legislation that I'm speaking about. But the significant fact is, now is the time for us to consider modernizing the state's workforce in terms of all of its rules. The other piece that's important about that is that the piece that I mentioned around the Constitution, there are only 15 states across the United States, only 15 of us, who actually have these rules embedded in the Constitution. And of those, only 4 of them have comprehensive rules, much like we have. So, again, we want to make sure that we're modernizing how we're administering the state's personnel system, and one way is to look at the particular change. We call this the Governor's Talent Agenda, and this is something that the Governor himself has weighed in on. Reggie Bika, along with the rest of the administration, we have spent many meetings trying to discern what is the appropriate amount of change for the workforce. And I think what we'll talk to you about is exactly where we need to be. And it's about retention, recruitment, and recognition, aka reward of our workforce. So how are we working to make some of those changes? One of the most important pieces that you will take away from this is we want to create flexibility, particularly for those of you who are listening or those of you in this room who are appointing authorities or are hiring managers, or if you have any contribution at all in terms of the hiring process, this legislation is important to you. The intent is to create greater flexibility so that we get the best and the brightest to come and work for the state of Colorado. So, about this process, it's not just on those rules, right? We're not going to be just talking about the Constitution and the statutory changes. We've also tried to make a lot of other changes to the workforce that would make your lives easier and better. And one of those is the pay advices. So one of the changes that I felt like, and I like to refer to it as low-hanging fruit, those opportunities that we can seize upon very quickly, was around the pay advices. We were producing some 30,000 pay advices, so printing all of those paycheck stubs, and then taking someone to correlate all of that and then deliver them all across the state of Colorado. And there's much more efficient ways of doing that, and one of those ways was to automate the system. So now all of that is electronic, and it saves the state on a monthly basis at least some $20,000 in terms of only being able to click on a button and then having the opportunity to print them. The pay date shift is also important. So many of you out there might be an hourly employee, and what you probably have come to realize is that the last payroll of the fiscal year, those individuals who were hourly paid had to wait potentially up to 17 days to get their paycheck. And we understood how that created hardships for many families out there having to wait an additional 2 weeks. And so we eliminated the pay date shift for biweekly paid employees. And so now, at the end of the fiscal year, those employees no longer have to wait in order of getting their paycheck. Passive open enrollment. Okay, we're going to take questions, but I'm going to, if you wouldn't mind just noting your question, and then we'll take the questions at the end just so that I make sure I have enough opportunity to get through all the material. So the other piece is the passive open enrollment. You probably all participated, if you take the state's insurance, in what's called the dependent eligibility audit. So approximately a year ago, we asked all of you to provide us information about whether or not you were still married, whether or not you had dependent eligible dependents on our benefits plan. One of the big takeaways from that many people don't know, going through that process saved the state approximately $1.3 million because we had ineligible dependents receiving benefits or providing coverage for individuals who were qualified. And so this year, we knew how cumbersome that was for asking for all of those documents. We're not doing that again this year, and nor do I think it was feasible or good use of our time to ask all of you to re-enroll. So we did a passive enrollment. So you didn't have to go back into the system. We kept you enrolled in whatever plan that you had before, and hopefully that saved all of you time, as well as the HR professionals, as well as the benefits administrators' time. We also made sure that we understood, we heard you loud and clear. I stand before you as the administration as well as representing the governor's office. We know that times are hard, and we understand that many of you have worked here for 4 years, 5 years without a pay increase. So we will talk about that a little bit, but we understand the significance around that. And so we made sure that this last session that we didn't pass off those medical premiums onto you and to your families. So we didn't have an increase in the medical premiums, although every year we're looking at 8 to 10% increases in medical premiums, but we did not pass those off to our employees. And then the last other accomplishment that I'd like to recognize when we're talking about the workforce is that there is a 2.5 parachute, or the swap as we like to refer to it, that you all should have received an additional 2.5 in your payroll check last month. So just a few days ago or a week and a half ago when you received your paycheck, you should have seen an increase in that 2.5. So that's another thing that the governor actually went out and supported, the legislature supported, and we were happy and pleased to see that additional 2.5 bump rate. So one of the main reasons that we're here, in addition to talking about where we've been and where we're going, is to talk about those statutory changes that were made. So House Bill 1321 specifically addresses two primary things. One is the elimination of bumping, and then two, merit pay. So let me start by talking about bumping, because that one and along with merit pay get a lot of questions. So the rationale behind it, I've been practicing as an attorney, employment and labor attorney for the last 15 years, and an HR professional about the same amount of time. And most employers have some similar process when you're looking at a reduction in workforce. So anytime there's an opportunity for us to reorganize or we talk about a job elimination, there's generally some kind of practice or mechanism that you have to use to identify who is going to be affected by that particular change. And one means of that is bumping. But what I've come to find out, particularly in the state, is that process is very cumbersome. And not only is it cumbersome, but it doesn't support my mission and the mission that I've been given by the governor in terms of hiring and recruiting and retaining the best talent for our positions. I felt like some of those positions or opportunities around bumping, you ended up with a body in a position, but you didn't get someone who really wanted to do that particular work. We lost expertise when we made some of those decisions, and there were a lot of hurt feelings that went around in terms of that. That being aside, we're also very conscious of the fact that many of you have worked here 25, 30 years, spent most of your lives working here. So we wanted to create some protections for those employees who have been with us for a very long time. So if your age plus years of service equal 75, then you retain bumping, because we didn't feel it was fair for you to spend an entire career here and then come to the end of your career and you lose it. So age plus years of service come January 1 of 2013, if you have it on that date, then you keep bumping. So that means if there's a job elimination and we go through that process and your age plus years of service come January 1 or thereafter, you will retain it until you retire. But for those of us who don't meet the rule of 75 or 74 or less, those individuals, what we've done to create greater protections is to create the opportunity for severance, job training, job placement services, provided the department where that individual works has the dollars or resources to be able to offer it. So we wanted to make sure that those interests were also met. So now where we're going. So talk a little bit about where we've been and some of the things that we are getting ready to implement, and now I'll spend a little bit of time talking about where we're going. And so one of the big pieces of legislation that will be on the ballot this year is called Amendment S. And we're calling this Yes on S, but the Amendment S talks about specific things, and I'll go through them in detail for you. Number one is around testing. So one of the takeaways that I was observed over the last 18 months is, first of all, we do testing a variety of different ways across some 20 agencies, not including higher education. And the big takeaway there is one size doesn't fit all. That we should be looking, as HR professionals out there, that we should be looking at the right interview techniques and skills for a given particular position. So I like to use the standard example about the state controller. So the state controller works in our office. It wouldn't make sense for that employee, if you're a recruiter, of those candidates, to take a mathematics examination for the state controller. And some of you are like, well, why not? Well, generally that individual has probably some 20 or 30 years of experience. And so that wouldn't necessarily make sense for that individual to be tested on some mathematics exam or some accounting exam. But it would make sense to have the behavioral interviewing. So how would you react to this? And can you give me some examples of times you had to testify before a legislature, et cetera, et cetera? Those types of questions might be more appropriate. And so what this piece of legislation does is create greater opportunities for the HR professional and the appointing authority, aka hiring managers, to have more involvement and more say about what type of interview techniques or styles, so long as they're proven methodologies. We don't want anyone just pulling a name out of a hat, for example. But we want to make sure that there's greater flexibility in hiring. Another big takeaway from that, not everyone's a good test taker. I don't know how many people you've thought about. Many of you are obviously work here, so you've probably gone through some examination. But it isn't necessarily the best way to attract the best talent is to say, come work for the state, and by the way, you have to take some type of examination. So we want to be thoughtful where it makes sense. We should be testing, and where it doesn't, we shouldn't. The other is on Rule of 3. So I like to, when I talk to HR professionals, this one sort of shocks most people who aren't employed with the state. So if you are filling a classified position, right now, the appointing authority only has the ability to interview 3 candidates for a position. And I think that's very limiting. You don't have the opportunity to really look at a diverse pool in terms of experience. Sometimes you might want to look at a candidate who is minimally qualified for the position, and other times you might want to really look at someone who is far more seasoned. When you expand that number from 3 to 6, which this piece of legislation would do, it creates a greater opportunity for us to widen the candidate pool so that an appointing authority and HR professionals or the boards or review panels or interview panels that you might use have a good opportunity to look at a breadth of candidates as opposed to just 3 for a particular position. Exceptions. So we get a lot of questions around exceptions. And so the big piece around the exemptions and exempting additional positions outside of the classified system is this. First of all, there's a cap. There's only 1% of the overall state classified system can be exempted at any given time. So that equates to about some 330 employees. And of those, that would have to include SES. And currently, the statute already provides that 125 of that 330 are already SES, and those individuals will be exempted from the classified system. So the question I get is, so what about that other 175 or so people? Those individuals who I have deemed as being very strategic positions that you might want to look outside of the 4 borders of the state of Colorado to recruit for. So, for example, it could be the deputy director for Department of Personnel or any of the other departments. It could be the state controller. I like to use a pick on the state controller because that position isn't normally found in the marketplace. So if you were to go out and advertise for this particular position, you're going to get a few people who probably have municipal experience, etc., but there isn't a natural pool as opposed to nurses, for example, or physicians, or I don't know, some other examples, accounting techs, or HR professionals. Those are probably considered normal for the workplace, and so you would find those in the marketplace. But there are some positions, particularly those that are SES and those other very senior roles in administration, who aren't. And so what this piece of legislation does by exempting it creates the opportunity for us to cast the net broader to get people with some very specific expertise to be able to fill some of those key positions. And so it goes back to, again, hiring, trying to recruit, retain, and reward the very best talent for the state. Residency is another big one, and this might create some opportunities for you, for this department, because this department has employees around the state of Colorado. The residency exempts the residency requirement, vis-a-vis you have to be a resident to apply for a position, if the position is within 30 miles of the state border. So if the position is within 30 miles of the state border, you automatically can post that position and take an applicant from anywhere. Obviously, we prefer if that person were to live here, but we also are very conscious that sometimes it could be just 2 miles or 3 miles to the state border, and it wouldn't be reasonable to expect that that person is going to pick up their family and then move just a mile or so in order to apply for a position. So this does create opportunities, again, to cast the net broader to get more candidates interested in our positions. The State Personnel Board is another change of this piece of legislation. And the intent there is to make the State Personnel Board look like other boards and commissions that are constitutionally created. Vis-a-vis, that basically means that we're adding term limits. So right now, a person who serves on the State Personnel Board can serve 5-year terms, 2 5-year terms, but they can do that ad nauseum. Most boards have some term limit, and so we're looking to make this one very consistent with that. So going from 5-year terms to 3-year terms, you can serve 2 of those terms, so a total of 6 years. So that's a specific change for the State Personnel Board. In addition to that, temporary employment, right now, you can hire a temporary for only 6 months, and then you have to have a 6-month waiting period. So we're making that from 6 months to 9 months, because we feel like 6 months is a little too short, 1 year might be a little too long, so we want to widen that opportunity. There are many projects that we have out there that we use for temporary, and it just felt as though 6 months was too long, particularly when you're talking about IT jobs. And then lastly, one of the most important pieces of this legislation is around veterans preference. We in the state of Colorado are trying to make sure that the state is a military-friendly state. So right now, if you are a veteran and you served in active duty, you have the ability to use preference points for your application process, but you can only use them once. And so we are eliminating that one-use rule, which means you, as a veteran, if you have that status, then you would be able to use that as many times as you feel necessary. The only exception to that is that it would not be used or counted for promotional opportunities. So, oh, okay, yes, I can go back. Sorry, I did skip that. Okay. So those are the specific changes around Amendment S. And before I end, I was reminded that I did not talk about merit pay, which is, if we go back to 1321 on the statutory changes, merit pay is the other. I mentioned that there were two significant changes. One is bumping, the other is merit pay. And the big change around merit pay is we're doing away from pay for performance. Now, I will tell you, as an HR professional, pay for performance is a standard practice. It is a viable practice, but it doesn't necessarily work for the state because that line never gets funded. And so we have created another opportunity that we think is going to create greater opportunities to move those individuals who are below the range minimum or below the middle of the market for their particular position, create opportunities for us to provide some additional dollars for a department to put toward that individual's base pay. The big other takeaway around that is that it will be based on not only where you are, we're going to put the workforce in 4 quartiles, so it's not only based on where you fall within the quartiles or where you are in the market, but it also is based on performance. So the better you perform, the higher the potential is for you to get a greater increase to your base pay. It also creates opportunities for those departments who have who are general funded to use reversions, and we are working to ensure that there's an opportunity or a mechanism if you have cash funds to be able to use some dollars from the cash fund, and we are then working on those who don't have cash fund and don't have general fund to figure out in those agencies what we might be able to do to create some available dollars for those agencies. So in a nutshell, those are the specific changes. You don't have to make sure, you don't have to try to memorize it all. We have a couple of documents when you leave that they're briefing documents that talk about both the piece of legislation on 1321 as well as Amendment X. So I'll pause, and I know there's anybody in the back who had a question. I'll be happy to take your question. Yes.
Related to the pay I've heard that will be only valid for this fiscal year 2013, and the next year, I'm not sure.
No, so payday shift didn't happen this year because the legislation said it had to happen in the next fiscal year. So the very next fiscal year, it will be applied, and it is a statutory change. So the intent is that it will be ongoing. What we're working on, and what may be confusing individuals, is that there is a payday shift that still exists for the monthly payroll. So that one will still be in effect, and that is where we're still working to see whether or not we can create an opportunity to get that one fixed. But there is an ongoing intent that that will be for the biweekly payday. That is correct.
Kathy, will you repeat the question so they can catch it?
Sure. For those of you who are listening in or viewing on your PCs, the question was regarding the biweekly payday shift and whether or not that was a one-time episode for the next fiscal year, or is that ongoing? And that is a statutory change, which means it will be implemented in perpetuity or until the legislation otherwise would change. Yes.
After another one, there were 2 of those things that I really like to support, but the 5 of them I don't like at all. Is there any way to separate those out so the board would be able to vote, one item per vote, one item per ballot issue?
Great, and I'll repeat the question. So the question was whether or not on Amendment S you can vote each one of those up or down individually, or whether or not it has to be done collectively. And the answer is it has to be done collectively. It is a one bill title. So all of them are in one particular piece of legislation, so you have to vote for or against the legislation in full. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Well, you mentioned reversions, and I don't know whether everybody knows what reversions mean.
Sure. And the question was, can I define reversions? So, as I mentioned in the House Bill 1321, the important piece or takeaway from that, or one of the important pieces or takeaways, is around merit pay and the opportunity to use reversions. So, if you have a general fund allocation, what that means is if you don't use it all, those dollars at the end of the fiscal year revert back to the total general fund, And so this creates an opportunity before it reverts back to the full pool that a department would then be able to allocate those dollars to use to either provide base pay or non-base pay awards, monetary awards to a workforce. And there are some caveats to that. You've got to make sure it's sustaining if it's base pay. You've got to get some approvals through OSPB. It has to follow my priority ranking in terms of which individuals I think are at the lower end of the range so that we move those individuals up faster. There's some caveats to it, but generally that's what that means. Yeah.
This is on merit pay as well. Obviously, one of the problems with pay for performance is it's designed to reward good behavior, good performance, and in actual fact, it punished it because you performed and you didn't get reinforcement. That's a punishment. And the whole problem was, as you mentioned, we did not have appropriations. So how is this different? What are there guaranteed appropriations, or are we going to be in the exact same situation?
Yes and no. So you may be in the exact situation, but I'm hoping that this will make things better. The question, so I'll repeat, the question is, how is merit pay any different than pay for performance? And the answer is this. So we are doing away with that one line item. So there isn't going to be just a sweeping of that particular line item. So that's one big difference. The second difference is there is still an element of performance, except that you're either a 1, you're a 2, or a 3. If you're 1, you're not going to get anything. If you're a 2 or a 3, there's going to be it's going to be differentiated between a 2 and a 3. If you're a 3, you're going to get a higher percentile than a 2. The question you have is around funding. Unfortunately, myself, the governor, none of us have control over that piece of it. That funding is a legislative, is a General Assembly prerogative. So if the General Assembly awards us dollars, we're going to make a recommendation of something, and whether or not that gets funded is based on the legislature. It isn't based on this system. But we've hopefully done two things. In addition to that, if it doesn't get funded, we still have an opportunity to provide an increase if there are reversions. So aside from the line items, et cetera, what this piece of legislation does is say, even if you don't fund that and you have reversions and or cash fund, there is still an opportunity to provide some kind of increase in pay. I'm sorry, before I come back there, she had her hand up. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the rating systems because the way it seems to usually come across is everybody gets a 2 because you have to walk on water 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for every week of the year to get a 3, and if you're a 1, you ought to be fired. So if everybody's a 2, what's the use of the rating system? I mean, how will that rating system be used to determine any increases?
The question is, how do we use the, you need to be repeated?
Yeah, if you can reach them, yeah.
The question is around the performance management, the rating system around performance. And with just a 1, 2, and a 3, how do you really create that delineation between 2s and 3s? Because in her words, 1 should be fired. So that's a big question. So let me start there. The intent isn't if you're a 1 to be fired. The intent is to ensure that you understand what the expectation is. But any person who is a 1 understands what the expectation is, and that we encourage them to improve their performance. So that's first. Second, I wouldn't advocate for a 3-pronged rating system. I'd move to something else. But this is managing the state's personnel system is like, someone told me, a bucket in an ocean. There is more opportunity than there is time. So I've got to stage the change, the amount of change that I think the workforce is ready for. So ideally, if we're talking about buckets of work, down here in bucket number 4 and 5 would be to change that system so that you have greater tiers. So you have people who are not meeting at all, some people who are, they're not walking out the door, but they're not really performing, and then you've got your standard, and you've got, I'm not walking on water, but I've done some really good things, and you have walk on water. And that's what I would move to, but I can't change everything. I'm only one person who works more than my 40. I have a family. So I appreciate your question, and it's down the road in terms of making that change, but in the interim, we've got to work with what I have. So It's not a perfect system, but I do believe that as we work with appointing authorities and executive directors on how to deliver the right performance evaluations, that will sort of balance out. But in a year or two, we'll get much better.
So I've heard the rule is we all get twos.
No, there's no
Yeah.
rule on Well, I will tell you, from a director from the state personnel director's perspective, there's no rule. There's nothing written in as the state personnel director's rules and or the state personnel board rules that I'm aware of that would state that. Now, how you administer them, here's the general rule of thumb. There ought to be only 10% of your workforce, if you range the 80-20 rule, 10% of your workforce, if you only have 3 ratings, 10% of them ought to be 3s. Majority of the people, 80% of them are going to be 2s, and there are going to be 10% of your workforce who is 1. That's just the general rule of thumb. And so people may take that and run with it and say everybody's a 2, but the general rule is 80% of your workforce are going to be working in that range. And if they aren't, you're not setting the right expectations in terms of what stellar performance is if you've got a lopsided half of your workforce is 3s. You're not setting the right set of goals. So, I know it's probably not what people want to hear.
Or you're going too crazy, have one.
That's right. That's right. Or it's chaos if you have more people outside of that in that 10%. So, I know it's probably not what people want to hear, but the majority of the workforce, 80% of them ought to be 2s, a small percent of them, 10% ought to be 3s, and a small percent of them ought to be 1s.
You mentioned revisions, but if you're 100% federally funded, and there's no general fund,
That's right.
you said you had it held with, right?
So we're looking at cash fund is one, cash fund lines is one opportunity. And another is there is an opportunity to move some dollars in the governor's office to another department to be able to utilize. But I hate to go out and say that because I won't set false expectations that would happen. But there are other mechanisms that we're trying to work for those that don't have either cash fund or general fund. We know that that's an issue. But at the same time, again, when you're managing a workforce of 30,000 and you only have $2 to work with, I've got to figure out what the greatest opportunity is. And if that means those that have reversions, we can use some of those dollars to help offset those that are below the range, then we're going to do that first. And then we're going to create other opportunities to fix that other pool. But to hold up on some until we can figure out the other piece, it wouldn't be judicious to do so. I know you already had one question, so let me go to her and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
How do you make it equitable between departments?
2 things. One, you've got to have a review by OSPB to make sure it's, one, sustainable and that we don't have a lopsided. What we don't want is one department who has a lot of general fund to be able to provide, some crazy increase to base, and we don't have a department who doesn't. So we will make sure that there is some monitoring of that to make sure that it is equitable in my mind. Give or take a 1 or 2% across the board, that it is very consistent, so that we don't have a department who gives a 10% increase to base for a couple of people and everyone else doesn't have one. So not only myself as a state personnel director, OSPB also has to review that. That's right, thanks. Another big takeaway for that is there's a difference between merit pay and salary survey. So we will still do salary survey. Salary survey is what is generally considered in the marketplace around a cost of living increase. So that is more like a peanut butter approach, regardless of where you are in the range, that there is some type of percent that is awarded to employees, provided they're not ones. So those individuals would see what's called salary survey. So we'll still keep salary survey. This is not salary survey. So merit pay is not salary survey. There are 2 potential ways of receiving an increase to base or a non-base increase. And I know the lady in the green had a question.
Well, you answered one of them. I wanted to ask you about salary survey, but this is connected with salary survey. I know that Colorado Winds, our employee organization, have worked with the state to improve the salary survey samplings, and I'm wondering if you are going to be doing some kind of revision to the sampling of the salary survey that we have right now.
Your question is really specific, so the question is whether or not WINS has made any recommendations around the mechanism we use to do salary survey. So I have worked tirelessly with Scott Wasserman, Mark Schmani, They've had a couple of other folks that they use during this process, so I've worked with them ad nauseum. And I believe it's a good product. I think everybody at the table felt like what we put forward was supported, which is evident because we had 100% of the legislature voted in favor of Amendment S, so it's bipartisan, everyone supports it. I don't have an answer to your specific question around how the survey was done. There are a lot of questions, but that one isn't resonating with me right now. But the conversations aren't over. This is an ongoing relationship. There is, like I mentioned before, this is a bucket and an ocean. There is more opportunity than there is time in the day. So if it isn't currently on the list of things, I got to prioritize how I approach change for the organization. So that would come later.
Can we take some questions from the folks on the
Yeah,
computer?
sure.
Sure. How would bumping rights work with interrupted service? So if you had served 10 years, then went to the private sector and came back, would you get the full total of your years served?
Yes, as I understand it, the question is whether or not you have interruption of service. I believe that those two episodes would be aggregated to give you one total year of service.
That doesn't happen.
She's saying it doesn't happen, so if that's not correct, then let's add it to our list of clarified. I will put it out in an email to you. But I believe the question came up before, and for the purposes of bumping, it did, and that doesn't mean it's changing for para or for anything else, but for the purposes of bumping, that was the intent. But I will double check it to make sure.
I was there. I've been there.
Okay, well, with the new process is what I'm referring to.
Okay.
So with the new process, I believe that the intent would be to aggregate that time, but I will go back and double check to see if there's any specific language to it.
And now, how are you going to answer these kinds of questions? You're going to tell email?
We're going to do an FAQ, but if there are questions that come up, you can email me or Sabrina or Mary Catherine. Mary Catherine Hurd is our legislative liaison. And then at the end in your presentation, you have the contact for Sabrina DeAgosta, who is our communications director. So you certainly can email them to me as well, any of the three of us. Yes, sir.
Are the funding schools sellers survey narrative different?
Yes. They both come through the legislature in terms of approval, but yes, they are two separate line items. Yes, ma'am. I'm going to go, after you, I'll go to.
Sure.
Regarding Amendment S, you mentioned something about the exempt positions. Is it true that if this Amendment S passed, EPA will determine certain positions that will be exempt? For instance, we'll say all GP7 will now be exempt. Then if so, does that mean they are at will, and do they get to choose?
Okay, so good question. The question is around the exemptions. Does this give GPA any rights to create other additional exemptions? And then what does it mean to be exempt? So the first part of the question is, doesn't give the state personnel director any additional rights in terms of creating additional exemptions. The legislation specifically calls out certain positions. CFOs, HR directors, PIOs, legislative liaison, and SES. Those specific, what is that? SES, Senior Executive Service, which are generally positions that are direct reports of an executive director, for lack of a better word.
And they're not part of the state personnel.
They are part of the state personnel system. They are currently classified under this piece of new legislation, SES, those positions that are generally direct reports of an executive director will be exempted. Somebody at will. And so what does that mean? At will. That's your second part of the question is whether or not they are at will. So at will is sort of an oxymoron. If you are a classified employee, there are certain rights and privileges that you have, and there are certain rules you have to follow in terms of hiring, firing, discipline, discharge. If you are outside of the classified system, there's a lot more flexibility. At will, sure, you can say at will, but generally speaking, we're not just going to show up one day and tell the person that they're fired. I don't think I've been practicing as an HR professional my entire career. Never seen it done, whether it's with the state or something else. So, yes, it is those individuals who are currently non-classified are generally at will. And that is like most of your neighbors who don't work for the state or don't work for government. It's treated the same way as most other employees are in the private sector. The second question, I think, or the second piece that I wanted to mention around, did you have a question? around the exemptions is if you are in one of those positions I mentioned before, SES, director, CFO, HR directors, PIOs, or legislative liaisons, you'll be grandfathered. So those individuals will be grandfathered into their current position so that they don't have to worry about moving to an at-will status or outside of the classified system. Those individuals would stay in their classified system. We're going to grandfather all of those individuals in. Except if you move, if you say I'm a PIO in DPA, and you want to move to a PIO in Human Services or HICPA, then you would lose that. You would voluntarily waive your right to move to a different position that's not classified. So long as you stay in the role that you're in, then you would remain classified. Yes.
I just wanted to do an additional clarification on that question. I just wanted to speak to the point that you made about Kathy or any personnel director having the opportunity to say all GP7s or all GP4s. That is absolutely false, and that would not happen under this. These are specific positions that are enumerated in the Constitution, and we would not be able to add or to do anything along those lines. So I just wanted to make that very clear, and whoever you heard that from, definitely let them know that that is not true under this initiative.
That is true. Thank you, Linda. Thank you. So yes, to answer that. No changes in terms of how we do exemptions. The current practice stays in place.
And to follow up with that, those people who are grandfathered, they do have to take care of, but what about the people who move out to a different job and they're no longer classified?
Non-classified employees, as long as you're a state employee, participate care. So I'm one of those. I'm not a classified employee, and I contribute to care. Looks like the governor's office and other positions. I'm going to take, yes, sir, and then I'll take one from him.
I'm a little bit confused.
Okay.
Will any positions be privatized?
This
Because that was what I thought I heard during the last webinar.
This legislation does not privatize anything. Period.
So people will not be moved out of the state system in any classification.
No. Under this legislation, under 1321 or Amendment S, this is not about privatization. There is no intent to privatize anything there. The only about moving around are moving that 330 potential people from a classified system to a non-classified system. That's it. But there is no privatization that I'm aware of that I've even been I haven't had any privatization conversations as it pertains to these two pieces of legislation. Well, who are those competitors in what? Those positions I just mentioned, those 5 positions I just mentioned. Oh, okay. HR director, PIO, legislative liaison, CFO, and then all of SES. And there are about 125 current potential positions that are SES. And those will be direct reports of the executive directors.
There's 7 in the document.
Okay, maybe I'm missing some. Tell me what they are.
Executive assistants and legislative
Oh, executive assistants. I missed the executive assistants. What was the other one?
legislative liaison.
I said that.
Yeah. Well, it's not about
And SES should be one of those 7. Go ahead.
6 times.
All right. I wasn't too far off. At least it should be. Go ahead.
Will temporary staff get any preference for permanent hiring under the new rules?
No changes in terms of preference for hiring. The only changes that we've made around preference around hiring is for veterans. The veterans' preference and be able to use the points ad nauseam.
Okay, and that was my next question. The VFW is under the impression that bumping rights for veterans will be retained. Is that the case?
No, there's no, if the bumping has to do with years of service, not in terms of any other classification. Years of service plus age have to equal 75 on January 1. All right, I'm going to take maybe 1 or 2 more questions. That door feels good. Thank you. I know you had a couple, so let me try to go to someone else. Yes?
Regards to constitutional amendment, where you could speak to how we're thinking about controlling for possible overbreadth of the amendment, and then the way that is going to affect concerns about reliability and consistency in hiring practices.
So tell me about overbreadth. I'm going to turn it, but I'm
Well,
not
it seems
thinking
like
about it.
some of those, like the testing, the exemptions, the residency requirement, a lot of those may or may not be applicable in certain divisions and certain job classifications where it actually really be a best practice.
Well, I think when you look at this in the aggregate, and I hope I'm answering your question, if you look at all of these changes in the aggregate, I think it's the best thing for the state. And that piece around testing, that's the part I'm getting to. I don't think the peanut butter approach works. Vis-a-vis taking the same methodology and apply it the same way for every single job. That's why the testing is important, because I think it matters as to what position you're filling, as to what methodology you use. The other question is in terms of making sure that there's consistency. We're working with the HR community to make sure that everybody understands this. This is why I'm going around this entire state and trying to talk to as many of the 30,000 or 100,000 of us who want to listen about those particular changes. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but certainly I can wait a few minutes afterwards and talk about it specifically if you have to. And yes, ma'am.
I heard on a webinar that those who are employees that are laid off, becoming back for their 2 or above, they will be given preference to other open state positions. Is that true or not?
I don't believe that there's anything in this legislation that would say if you are 2, you get preference. The difference is if you're a 1, I don't believe you have much preference at all if you're a 1. But I can't think of any other way that there would be a preference for a 2.
Okay.
Yes? Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Because I think did you say that in the event of a layoff, would there be any preference for an employee?
Who's a 2?
Who's a 2? There's nothing in terms of the rating system involved in what would be available for an employee who doesn't meet the rule of 75. So if you're 74 years and below, in the event of a layoff, we have set in place preference in being placed into a fully funded vacant position for which you meet the minimum qualifications, potential preference points of placement on a reemployment list for the department, educational vouchers, and severance pay if that's available throughout your individual department. So I think that's the preference that you're referencing, but there's no attachment to your performance evaluation based off of that.
It would come from the department. That's why it's stated that if there is funding, then that creates an opportunity. Currently, the rules don't offer severance for someone who has more than 5 years of service. This changes the legislation to create an opportunity to provide that if there is funding for it within a department. Yes. Yes.
Yes, and I'm wondering how that would take place. I mean, is it going to be a leave or something that have some particular state?
Let me explain that. So the question was, the legislation talks about the priority groups that are developed by the state personnel director. And so if you look at our workforce, all 30, let's just talk about classified workforce because that's what the state personnel director is responsible for. If we were to plot all 30,000 on a grid and say you have 4 quartiles, first quartile, second, third, and fourth quartile, all in a grid. And that first quartile are people who fall below the mid-range. So the range goes from here to point here, and the middle of the range is where you want the majority of the workforce, right? I wish I had a whiteboard I'd write up here. So that first quartile are people who fall below the range. The methodology or the compensation philosophy is to get as many people into that midpoint as possible, knowing that there will be a small percent of people who will be below because those are people who are fresh graduates, who don't have, or just received their license, etc., that should be at the lower end of a range because they're not as skilled or as professional as some. Then you will have people who are, to this young woman's response or comments earlier, who walk on water, who are dynamic, or who have very special expertise. Those individuals might fall outside of that range. The majority of the workforce is going to be in those middle 2 quartiles. What my legislation or this legislation will do, or did, it's passed, is to say if we don't have any money as a state, there is no way that I'm going to get those first 3 quartiles or those first 2 quartiles to move everybody to the middle of the range. That's some $77 million. We're not going to get $77 million. So the next best opportunity that I think, if I were doing my job, which I'm trying to, is to say if you only have a certain amount of money, focus on those individuals in that first quartile And let's try to move those people who are below the range, who are coming to work every day and performing work satisfactorily, let's get them, try to be in the middle. And if you have anything else, then I can tell you how to spend the money. But don't take peanut butter and give everybody a flat across the board, because all you're doing is just moving your scale, moving your scale, moving your scale, and you're never getting people who are getting paid below the market up to market. So the intent behind the priority groups is for me to make a recommendation to OSPB and to the governor to say, if you have any money, give money to this group first, then give money to this group, and to give money to this group. And then you sort of sprinkle a little bit of performance in that. The higher performers get a little bit more, et cetera. But that's the intent behind the strategy around merit pay. I'm going to close it now. You have one more question?
I just have one more question. You're talking about the salary survey. Are you going to present that to the legislature in this next session?
I am going to make a recommendation. We're not prepared to do it so right now, so you didn't see that in the August 1st compensation letter. But I'm working on a recommendation to send to OSPB as well as to the governor that would include salary survey. Thank you for your time. I love all the questions, and if you have more that I didn't get to, I apologize, but certainly send them to me. And thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for all your hard work.